Finally, after 3 reviews of different barbarian stories that all cribbed from the original barbarian, Conan, I am finally ready to talk about the real deal, except that I'm not completely convinced that the 1982 film Conan the Barbarian actually represents the air quotes real Conan. My experiences with Conan actually come from the Marvel Comics series from the 1970s, specifically the first 25 issues collected in the essential Conan the Barbarian. So I am not what you would call a purist, since I have not read any of the Robert E. Howard's original stories featuring this character. But the Conan that I've come to know from the comics, he's a very solitary man. In a lot of ways, he's like the Hulk. Both characters just want to be left alone. They're often looked at as inferior by the rest of air quotes society, and they are usually pulled into the story through the actions of some other character. Conan might kill a corrupt warlord only because the warlord killed a comrade that he was traveling with. In that regard, the character of Conan is something of a problem when you look at him as a protagonist and how easy it might be to tell stories about him. I can only imagine that it would eventually get tiresome to try and concoct ways to get Conan involved in a story, since he's fairly uninterested in society and things that happen in society. This is all to say that I don't mind if the film changes the character, since the character of the comics that I have read, he is somewhat flawed and doesn't entirely work as the center of an ongoing series. But the changes that were made to the character of Conan here don't really seem like improvements. The Conan of the film, he somehow seems less intelligent than the Conan of the comics that I have read. Conan is known for being muscle-bound, but if you think about all of the monsters, armies, and death traps that he's been involved in, sure, he used his strength in those situations, but it was almost a case of his strength serving his mind. He has to be a smart guy to evade the law when he's in a populated city stealing the crown jewels or something along those lines. The Conan of the film, I don't buy him as smart. We're told in the first 30 minutes of the film that Conan was taught philosophy and was educated, but this is exactly the problem. In college, I had a creative writing professor who liked to tell us, show, don't tell. This movie tells us that Conan is smart and knows about philosophy, but it fails to show me Conan using his brain at any point in the movie. Anytime he and his fellow thieves are on the job, I actually feel like Valeria is smarter than Conan. When they are rescuing a princess from Thulsa Doom, she is the one who takes the princess. When Conan dies because he ran off by himself like an idiot, Valeria is the reason that he comes back to life. When the thieves are brought before a king, it's Valeria's quick wit that tries to cover for the absence of the other thief. Conan feels like an observer in his own movie. He does do some things, mind you. He doesn't feel quite as inactive as, say, Cole of Atlantis. When the thieves are raiding Thulsa Doom's headquarters, Conan tips a very impressively heavy-looking vat of boiling Nickelodeon slime. But compared to a supporting character who is doing the actual work, this is nothing. I think all of this comes down to the importance of an actor in a role. I've heard Conan in this film and the 2011 film compared to Superman, and I think, for the purposes of this review, that is an apt comparison. Arnold Schwarzenegger is a bodybuilder who was put into movies and was told to act. And while I like him in some movies, like Predator and the first 2 Terminator films, he doesn't really do much in those movies. In Predator, he's the vessel for the action of the movie to take place. And in the Terminator films, he's more of a force of nature than an actual character, so he doesn't have to do a whole lot of acting there either. So despite my enjoyment of those films, I don't think it's unfair to say that Arnold isn't really a good actor. Sure, he looks impressive, and if you look at a picture of Conan from the books, you might see why Arnold was chosen for the role. Now think of the Superman movies from around this same time. Christopher Reeve was an unknown actor who could actually act, and the creators of the movie convinced him to bulk up so that he would resemble Superman. This is the approach that should have been taken with Conan. It might have been hard to find someone with biceps the size of tree trunks, but I would much rather have a scrawnier Conan who can actually make me believe that he is Conan and the star of his own film than someone who looks like he came off the page but can't deliver lines or act out of a wet paper bag. I do have other problems with this movie outside of the protagonist. The story of this film is as follows. Conan is a child of Chimeria. Thulsa Doom, played by James Earl Jones, brings his army to slaughter all 12 people of what I assume is Chimeria. Conan and the rest of the children are brought into slavery. We see Conan grow up. He is traded to a warlord in the east, where he is taught to fight, and then one of the slave owners sets him free. This all takes 30 minutes of a movie that is 2 hours and 10 minutes long. After escaping slavery, Conan goes on a series of unrelated adventures filled with sex, thievery, debauchery, raiding a castle, crucifixion, returning from the dead, and another raid on a castle, and then finally taking his revenge on the man who killed his father and mother. This story is not enough to sustain a film. Most of the middle and end of this movie really are unrelated to Conan's quest to avenge his family and nation. To make this movie a full-length feature, we have to insert things unrelated to this storyline, such as Conan and his friends rescuing the daughter of an aged king who respects their courage. There could have been ways to take the core story of this movie and make it work as a complete film, but the creators of this film did not do that. I really have a problem with the actual story not even starting until 30 minutes into the movie. Maybe it's because I'm already fairly familiar with this kind of character, so I don't need 30 minutes to tell me that he was a kid who watched his family die and then he grew up in slavery. But even if the filmmakers behind this film thought that this character and world were unfamiliar to their target audience, there are faster ways to explain that Conan was a child who grew up in slavery. Let me show you. Conan was a child who grew up in slavery. See, it doesn't take 30 minutes. Without going through a scene-by-scene analysis of what I like and dislike about this movie, I will move on to something a little less time-consuming. In my review of Cole the Conqueror, I briefly talked about the way a film like this should be set up. The protagonist, the antagonist, we are all familiar with these words and what they should mean in a movie. Specifically, the antagonist is a character with goals that mean opposition from or toward the protagonist. So if Batman wants to bring order and justice to Gotham, then the Joker wants to tear it all up and sow seeds of chaos. Boom. Two characters with diametric goals. Conan the Barbarian's Thulsa Doom is a really failed version of the antagonist, when you think in these terms. At the beginning of the movie, he is part of the army that kills Conan's village. But he looks bored when he takes off his helmet. Both of his lieutenants look more bloodthirsty and capable of killing a more or less defenseless Chimerian woman. But we spend what feels like 47 eternities watching James Earl Jones make eye contact with a woman before he turns around, but, fake out, he turns around and slices her head off. Why? Why does he do this? Why does he bother coming off his horse to kill this woman? I also mentioned in my review of Cole that characters should make decisions that make sense based on what they want. If they are only making decisions that are happening because that's how the plot needs to unfold, then it is a bad character, and quite often that leads to a bad movie. Thulsa Doom has no visible motivations or goals of any kind. Later, when Conan tries to go after Doom himself, Doom seems world-weary and says that he was more interested in steel and combat when he killed Conan's mother. Could have fooled me. But Thulsa Doom is the patriarch of this evil snake club. So what are his goals? We find out that this snake cult has been spreading, and one guy says that they kill people in the middle of the night. We see them sacrificing a pretty little girl when Conan and his buddies are stealing a jewel from one of their castles. But why are they doing these things? Things like character motivations are extraordinarily basic. If you can't tell me what the bad guys want, or what they are after, then you need to go back to the drawing board. Even something that might seem cliched, like, Thulsa Doom wants to spread his evil snake cult into every city in the world, and he will secretly rule the entire planet through his lackeys, who all insert themselves into the hierarchies of each city and kingdom. This is a goal that makes sense for someone who I can only describe as warlord cult leader. And even if Conan isn't interested in saving the world or fighting in wars, he can still come into conflict with this guy for an entirely different reason. That's fine. But Doom having no motives, to me, is intrinsically tied to Conan himself not really having any kind of arc himself. At one point, before the final battle, Conan says a prayer to his god Crom. Earlier in the film, he says that Crom doesn't listen to his prayers. Okay, this is some kind of change in this character, but I don't really know what it means for Conan himself. Did his belief system change in some way, and if it did, what were the events in the plot that led to this change in character? Was it Valeria dying that made him think to pray to Crom? We don't know, and by the end of the movie, I don't really care, because the hero isn't very interesting and neither is his foe. At the end of the day, Conan the Barbarian is a very lowbrow film. I'm not sure if it's a film where the people behind it were actually trying and just failed miserably, or if it's a film where they didn't try at all and somehow were able to get away with making a sequel despite this lackluster attempt at a movie. Either way, I just don't think there's much of a reason to watch this film. You can find better barbarian stories, even ones featuring Conan. I guess I'll find out if the next 2 Conan films are any better or worse than this one, and you can come find out then if those movies are worth your time. More than this one, anyway.